Welcome back to the C-Realm Podcast. I'm your host, KMO, and joining me again is Michael Tsarion. Michael Tsarion is an independent author, a researcher, now a filmmaker, and he is well represented on the World Wide Web. And if you are a longtime listener to the Red Ice Creations radio program, then you will be very familiar with his voice. Michael Tsarion, welcome back to the C-Realm Podcast.
Oh, thanks, KMO. Nice to be back.
I just played a clip for the audience that was recorded at the recent Horizons conference. It took place here on the East Coast of the United States a few weeks back, and Robert Forte was talking about the various voices in the psychedelic community. The spokespeople tend to, they have a genetic lineage that runs right back to the Emerald Isle. They all tend to be Irish, have Irish names, and have that sort of Irish fluid tongue that is so that the Irish are so renowned for producing. And I'm wondering what thoughts that sparks in your mind, given that you have written so extensively and researched so extensively on the topic of Ireland and the Irish role in not just European history, but global and human history.
Well, of course, you can't underestimate, the role of the Irish within the political sphere. You can't underestimate the Irish, connection in regards even the American War of Independence. You have the Thomas Paines and the Burkes. You have a lot of theorists and analysts coming out of Ireland. The Irish have always been a sort of political people. You can understand they've had conflict in their own land for centuries. Long before America even existed as a continent, they were already, fighting the royal dynasties of the planet, already resisting, already dying for their causes, whether you agree with those causes or not. This is the fact of the matter, and so you're gonna find the Irish pretty much highly represented in these areas of criticism, and some are just cynics, and others are critics, but others are great authors, others are great columnists and journalists, you see, because they have an intimate, rebellious streak. I mean, there's an old Gaelic, proverb that if you shake a tree, either a poet, or a mystic or a rebel will drop out of it. So, they're very rebellious people, and they have had living experience of the jackboot. They've had living experience of the gun to the head. They've had experience of, colonization, colonialization, and a very, very profound sense of tyranny. So it's in their blood, It's in their blood, and of course, in an American context, in the media, they're going to be highly represented, and it's good to see that,
You are speaking of history that is within living memory. The Irish have been occupied by the British, and they have been invaded by other peoples prior to that. In fact, the Celts, as I understand it, are not native to the region, that they are the invaders. But I know that in your work you go back even further, and there are elements at play that are rather to the sort of mainstream mind rather fantastical, and I would like to invite you to just basically put your cards on the table and spill all the intimate and sometimes gory details of your theory.
You're right, they are fantastic, because we have been so brainwashed, by establishment historians, and I'm glad to say that I feel very positive about this new information coming out. We're in the perfect age for it. The technology is here to broadcast that. The evidence for theories that at first glance do seem quite, fugitive and vagrant, actually are backed up now every week, every month. There's more and more fascinating information and corroboration coming out about these theories. I would probably say that one of the most, significant and controversial of the theories involves the west to east movement of the elements of civilization. That's not to say that elements of civilization did not, as the history books say, come from the east. They have done so, but those were in a much later age, particularly from 600 BC, onwards into the AD. But you see, there were the pre-Diluvian civilizations. There were civilizations before 600 BC, and stretching back for many thousands of years. And there was this migration from the west into the east, which originally brought. Now, anytime that you do hear a mainstream coverage of that movement, and there have been times when you do hear it speculated upon, it is almost invariably delivered as an invasion concept, in which invading hordes, invading Scythians, invading Celts or Gaels or what have you, moved into the south and into the west, into the east. I mean, But, of course, what we really discover is that there's a big difference between an invasion of a particular party and a migration of a particular party. But even before we get into the data of it, my basic approach to this is just a common sense one. And that is that, look, if you can go down to the bottom of your driveway and you can turn left and drive up that way, what is to stop you turning right and driving down that way? From a common sense point of view, there is nothing to prevent us examining and taking on board, you see, this idea that there was a Western movement. The reason, as I said again, why we don't take it on board is because of the propaganda that's been released for years. But we also have to remember that the propaganda that absolutely makes that Western movement taboo is coming from the same source as the people who told you that you would fall off the edge of the world if you traveled in a boat too far to the west. So, I don't think, I think we've moved on sufficiently to realize that, those oracles are hardly to be believed, since it's exactly the same oracle that's telling you a preposterous story of the flat earth and all sorts of goblins and ghouls and demons and dangers, existed if you even traveled physically to the west, is the same coterie that basically broadcast the idea, you see, that the elements of civilization came from the Romans, Greeks, and Jews. So, just again, a common sense understanding helps you to at least dabble, to dip into the information to see if it holds any merit and move from that point. So it's not dogmatic, it's not declarative, it's not, a form of propaganda of its own. It's a simple intellectual curiosity and a questioning of whether we can turn history on its head. And that's what alternative historians do. For a lot of people, that might mean, readjusting their settings. And that's difficult. There is a certain learning curve involved in that. And there's also a need to distrust, the kind of official reports about history, particularly about certain tribes and nations. And I think that's a very healthy thing to do, because the way that we've been taught, the way that our worldview is, particularly involving archaeology, topography, geology, the division of the different countries in the world, their borders, a lot of this is fabricated. A lot of it is unsustainable. The preposterous idea that there was no connections between the Old World and New World. The preposterous idea that there was no connection between Pakistan, the Indus Valley, and Scythia, or that there's no connection between Egypt and Ireland, etc. Utterly nonsensical. And then, of course, we have the physical corroboration in which they're digging up red-headed and blonde-headed, blue-eyed mummies and burial, at burial sites, as far away as New Zealand, as far away as the Tarim Basin, as far away as the Gobi Desert. So one sacred cow after another is being demolished, and what I tend to want to do in my work, what my work actually does, is to take all of these pieces and put them together in a framework that explains the history of the past, so that we can make sense of some of these new discoveries. Because again, there's a danger, you see, that if you don't do that, the system will come along and reinterpret it for you in order to just basically corroborate the status quo. Because there's a lot of people stand to be, in basically professional and academic jeopardy because of these new revolutionary discoveries that are happening all over the world. And believe me, the list is very long. I feature it on my websites. All the discoveries. I have collaborators all around the world who send me information. It's just unbelievable. We have information just this very week coming out on the Vikings of Scandinavia, showing that, we basically have to reevaluate our complete understanding of who these people were, and right across the board, from Bolivia to South America to the Andes to the Maya, we're in a state now where we can reevaluate all the information that we've been shown. Number one, to show that these people were not primitive. Number two, to show that they were interconnected throughout the world. There's dispersion, concept going on. And so many other fascinating things to get into, that were never taught in history school and probably will never be taught in history school.
As I've been listening to you, it occurs to me that there are probably listeners who are not fully versed enough in the official story of the progression of civilization, Western civilization and global civilization, to really understand what you're saying about how your work tends to disagree with that. Let me just throw out a seed, and then I'll let you elaborate on that in terms of the official story, and then you can start to show some of the flaws in it, if you would. We hear on TV or, read in books or whatnot, just at a superficial level, that Mesopotamia is the cradle of civilization. And when you're talking about Western civilization, generally the story starts in the Mediterranean, talking about basically the Greeks and then the Romans, and then we go from there, and then there's the rise of Christianity, and there's the history of the church in Europe, and basically that is presented as the history of civilization, and then there's something that went on over in China, and they sort of had their parallel development that doesn't have a lot to do with European and Western civilization. That, I think, is, a pretty cartoonish sketch of the official story. If you would, take it from there, flesh it out a little, and then tell us what's wrong with that.
Well, you made a really good point there, and it ties into why my the books on the Irish origins, tend to be thick. They have, about, I think it's about 2,000 pages altogether. And the reason is because I don't just state the alternative view. My books work for beginners who maybe are not familiar, as you said, with some of this stuff, because I do always lay out what the official story is, and then, add my own sort of a level to it. So people will really love the read, because, and also we have a DVD coming out in about 2 weeks on the Irish origins, where, again, make sure to sort of tell you what was going on in an official context, and then we present, the alternative view on that. So I definitely want to do that. And of course, you're absolutely right. And remember, don't forget that I'm not saying that all official history is wrong. We're talking about a scale of rightness and a scale of wrongness. A lot of history is right on, bang on. It depends if you're talking about BC, if you're talking about AD. But there's a great deal of information in the ordinary history books that is accurate. Some of it is 30% true. Regarding Mesopotamia, for instance, you see. But you see the thing that one has to understand about the Amorites, or say even the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, other groups that, habitated and cohabitated in the Middle Eastern Mesopotamian area, is that their own records, their own writings, insist that their ancestors came from the Northwest. So my work does not basically posit anything that is spurious at all. I go to the works, like the great Babylonian scholar A.Y. Sayce, who's a Victorian writer who was one of the first people to go and read up on the Babylonian language, who was one of the first interpreters, you see. Or the works of L.A. Waddell, who was one of the very first men to read Sumerian, and from his analysis of Sumerian script, he found connections to Ireland, and so forth and so on. So my work is very much referenced. It goes to the original sources of some of the original teachers. It is also up on the latest discoveries. In fact, my book was almost delayed for almost a year, because I had read up on every one of the latest, books, as a good author should do. You should read up on all the latest information on the Celts, on the Gaels, on the movement of these people, so that it's topical and it's up to date. As I said, the appendices section, which is online free, features all the absolute up-to-the-minute information on these discoveries. Be those on Troy, new discoveries about the Greeks, new discovery about the Thracians, new discoveries about the Mycenaeans, or the role of, say, Macedonia, for instance, you see. New information about Julius Caesar and the conquest of Judea. New information on the Jews and whether or not these people have any ancestry, or whether it was a matter of religious conversion. All sorts of fascinating areas that we need to look into. And so it's a collaborative study. My work, for instance, is a follow-on from, mentors of the past. Some of them from America, like the great Ignatius Donnelly and others. So it's jump-starting the study of this East to West movement. It is looking at some of these historical things. But the main thing to remember, you see, is it deals with the roots of tyranny. My work is all about let's understand history, because history is always being played out right now, and it's not so much a case of history actually. It's a case of that the roots of the modern status quo, the modern world that we live in, both its good elements and its bad elements, are rooted in today. What a historian mostly does is present to you the nice, cushy flow of the elements of modern civilization, like the Renaissance and the coming of the Industrial Age and the Great Age of Invention and the Neoclassical period and the rise of, the modern age, in sort of more of a positive way. They kind of put this glowing, wonderful, Grecian, Latinesque, godly, especially when they're talking about the rise of Judeo-Christianity, they're putting the sheen on it. And they're very loath to show you the other thread in the rope, which is, that some of this stuff is not pleasant. Some of the elements that we find in our world today, the genocide, the tyranny, the suppression, the movement of the secret societies, the class system, the colonization of different places, the mind control, all of this also has its roots in the ancient past. And so it's not that I'm really studying history per se. It's I'm studying the manipulation of the study of history. And so that we can understand more about ourselves and more clearly about, the roots of the various tribes, nations, and peoples of the world.
I know that the details of your theory and the general picture, that you have of the movements of the people in the world are very fresh and vivid in your mind. And I'm afraid that the larger picture is not really emerging for people who are not already initiated into that larger picture. So I wonder if you would just pull back away from the details and sketch out in very broad strokes the notion of how people have moved about the globe and how that has shaped cultures and really what role Ireland plays in all of that.
Well, that is to me, one of the most fascinating subjects that anyone could ever look into. And it has to actually, its roots are in at least one global, if not cosmic, cataclysm. And when I say cosmic, I mean reaching out into our solar system. There was some event that happened about 50,000 years ago that was just awful. An Earth cataclysm, and I dealt with that in the first book I wrote, which was on Atlantis. But then there is a great deal of evidence that about 13,500 years ago there was another kind of cataclysm of equal, if not slightly less. Again, one can't be very sure, but something absolutely ginormous took place. An enormous cataclysm. So big, so violent, and so global that future, less important, not less important, but less grand cataclysms, for instance, deserts drying up, the submersion of certain land masses, ice drift, which of course is what the Ice Age theorists have picked up upon, you see. So we're framing all of this in a different way. But it turns out about 13,500 years ago something happened that there's ripple effects down through the millennium. 6,000 years BC. There's famines in the Bronze Age. There's tsunamis in Scandinavia. There's a drying up of deserts in Africa that used to be fertile crescents. There's changes in the Mediterranean. There's ice sheets appearing in Europe, which then led a lot of scientists to believe that, Cro-Magnon man, for instance, remains could not be found in Europe. All, again, stuff that's being now revised. But in short, like you're asking, basically the whole roots of the whole subject of the movement of these races and the displacement of these ancient peoples occurred not through will, not because they wanted to, but because the lands of the Northwest, and those lands are, in fact, the lands of Atlantis. So when you're talking about Atlantis, to take it out of the fairy world, to take it out of fairy tale, to take it out of the clouds, you are actually talking about Britain. You may also be talking about northern Scotland, you see, Scandinavia, Iceland, Denmark, and even you may be talking about the Arctic as being one great fertile continent of ancient times. There's a lot of corroboration in the science world for this, recent discoveries, etc. Now, the devastation that hit the globe was particularly destructive there. And so what happened then is that those people, just as you saw in the Indonesian tsunami, people just don't sit around, having cups of tea when a tsunami hits. They're forced to move, and move very quickly. So the same kind of thing happened in ancient times in the lands of the Northwest, forcing these people that then enter into history as the Celts, the Gaels, the Goths, the Nordics, the Teutons, and so on. And in my work, there is no problem, absolutely no problem whatsoever, in accepting that these individuals from these hemispheres, you see, then had to move. And they moved southward, and they moved eastward. And we find out from their own records that they did so, and you find out from the records of the people that they visited that this was so. These records will talk about things like the coming of the brothers, the coming of the gods, the coming of the Pahona, the coming of, Quetzalcoatl, etc. All the nations talk about the visitation of, the Nordics, or the Gothic men, the men of the stag, the men of the goat, the men who had excellent healing abilities, who were very up on geomancy, who were very brilliant mariners, who were excellent astrologers, who were expert horseback riders. Their women were exceptional. They were excellent jewelry makers, you see. All sorts of these anecdotes. The coming of the Arya is basically one of the ancient names for them. They were just basically the elders from the ancestral lands. But those ancestral lands were wrecked, and so they were uninhabited for many thousands of years. And this then assisted later historians to create the concoction of history that we know today, in which it seems very plausible that, in fact, elements of civilization came out of the East. Like you said, the cradle being perhaps Mesopotamia and India. The only trouble with those theories is, as I said, if you go to the work of those ancient tribes, in fact, if you even physically go today and interview people at Benares and people in Punjab, anyone from India, they don't believe anything of the sort. They're the first to tell you. Their ancient chronicles, like the Srimad Bhagavatam and the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and the Vedas, are the first to tell you. A study of their king lists corroborate the fact that their cultures and their civilizations were either completely brought in by migrants from the West, or that there was a meeting, a very amicable meeting halfway. So in my work I do not say, you see, that there was no civilizations in the East. But the powerful elements, the zodiac, for instance, you see, and certain other elements of writing can be found, and they bear these Western elements. So when a scholar like L.A. Waddell, Commons Beaumont, Conor McDarry, and in an American context, two people that Americans should know about KMO, which is Ignatius Donnelly, as I mentioned before. He was a good friend of Abraham Lincoln. And the great Barry Fell. But then you also have in recent times, more in a biblical context, the John Allegros. And now, of course, in recent years, you have even more scholars, coming out a little bit higher profile to bring these controversial ideas together. But you see, the Earth went through these physical changes. And this prompted then the mass migration of Western people, Northwestern peoples, into the lands. It is no more preposterous to believe that than it is to accept, as everybody accepts, that after the rise of Christianity, wandering monks migrated on foot or on horseback throughout the world to bring the teachings of Christ. You see this in the movie. If people are a bit shaky on that theory, pick up the movie The Name of the Rose with Sean Connery, which exactly will show you that the Franciscan and Dominican monks, had a habit of traveling throughout the world to preach the gospel. Well, if they could do it, is there something sort of different with the human being who was a member of the Arya, a millennia before? If Marco Polo could manage it, why is it preposterous to believe, you see, that other great people would have accepted it? And as I said, if you go to the legends of Greece, the Greeks know that the school of Pythagoras was actually started by a character known as Abaris. It's in the ancient Hermetic texts that the school of Pythagoras was visited before its inception and was greatly inspired by a Scythian, that means a Western Scythian, by the name of Abaris. So within certain esoteric traditions, you see, and as I said, even within the legends and the histories of these Eastern peoples, they're the first to tell you. The very word Iran is a Farsi word meaning Aryan. So, and words like Syria and Saqqara, you see, and like I said, Benares, and so many other word roots. There's a whole study of this to show these Western elements in Egypt and in Mesopotamia and in the lands of the East. And what I'm focused on is this fascinating thesis. But of course, I'm more interested in why official history has not accepted it, why they don't honor that. Is it because it didn't happen, or is it because it did happen? And there's a vested interest in why it's not being taught. That the scholars who've written on this have been, in many cases even violently suppressed. So are we dealing here with a conspiracy in which there are facts about the world and facts about the Phoenicians and facts about the Chaldeans and on all of these different groups, that the power brokers of the world, be they Masons or Knights Templars or Illuminati, whatever term you want to use for them, you see, is there a reason why these histories must be covered up, must be suppressed? And to me, that's the secondary, fascination.
Well, Michael, you have just posed a question. Why is it that an official history, the one that enjoys the recognition and the endorsement of our official and recognized leaders and power structures and keepers of knowledge, why is it that is the official history? And it seems like a rhetorical question that you're asking. So I would just invite you to throw out a potential answer to that question that you've posed.
Well, I'm totally convinced, from my earliest studies to the last day, that we are not being given the facts about the nations, the tribes, the races, the dissemination, and so forth and so on. Basically, that we're not being told the truth about history. Even from within Orthodoxy, they admit that history is written by the victors. Even within the Christian community, people who are scholars admit that when it comes to the Bible, there's a thing known as pious fraud, and that certain even chapters and passages of the Bible have up to 200 interpretations, multiple editions of the Bible, multiple editors. And then when we dig deeper, you find that some of these editors are talking about, i.e., the Sir Francis Bacon's and whatnot, were high degree members of secret societies, and were very, very closely tied to the kings and the noblemen and to the Knights Templar families, you see, that I believe are still very much in power, and that they are still operating, behind the governments of the world. And so these people who have manufactured the history are basically tyrants. Tyrants is not something you read about in Plato, or occasionally a Pol Pot, or a Rises in the World, or a Joseph Stalin. You see, it's something over there. We've got to realize that this psychopathy is basically ubiquitous, and just like in milk, cream rises to the top. Unfortunately, in the political milieu, it's the scum that rises to the top. And my work even gets into many of the dynamics of why that is. But fundamentally, I'm a person who understands that there is a tyrannical action at work, that tyranny is on consciousness, but that tyranny also involves subjects like history. And so the people who are composing this and who are behind this obviously don't want the roots of this tyranny to be discovered and to be revealed. They don't want it, they haven't wanted it, and they resist it. And they've set many things in place to prohibit, individuals who haven't jumped through all these academic hoops. It make it very difficult for them to disseminate these particular, points. But the tide has changed somewhat, and because of the new technologies and just because of diligent work and a lot of, gutsiness, we're able to now broach these subjects once and for all and present them in front of the people so that they can start to evaluate for themselves the level of this tyranny. Because it is ultimately a form of mind and life control, and I don't want to see people like that. We can't be talking about illusions of independence, freedom, and individuality, you see, while those subtle, unseen controls affect us. Somebody might say, well, nobody's controlling me, the way a master might train a dog. Yes, but don't we know that habitat can be manipulated outside, the peripheral vision? An ant may not be moved around with a stick, but the habitat of the ant could be changed so that all the behavior of the ant eventually, changes. We've seen this within the fauna. We see this within the animal kingdom. That you can train directly an animal right in front of it, or you can alter its habitat. So it's a twofold form of tyranny that's taking place here, And I believe that we're in the age to really start to, pull back from the canvas and evaluate some of this stuff. And to me, it's absolutely fascinating, and I can say that I'm thrilled with, the responses of people who are looking into this, and many people have an essential part of this that they've also been researching.
Well, Michael, again, your answer to my question sparked more questions in my mind than I could possibly ask in the context of this segment that we're recording now. So I would like to have you back on next week, and we will continue the conversation then.
Oh, that sounds good, KMO. Appreciate it.
insane world to which we need psychic immunity. 70 summers is what most people will say. 70. 28,000 days is what we've got. So it's not about the days, is it then? Obviously, even the child will start, as I say, the child's action will start to work this out as it grows. So it's not really about the days then. I was kind of traumatized about that. That's kind of arises fear in me. I've had some sweaty nights thinking about it. But you know something, I realized something else. It's not really about the time, is it? It's about the quality, the way I live it. Yeah, it's just transcended time right there. Didn't need the guru. No mushroom heads required. The value of value awakens. Osiris rises. The value of values can enter you at any time whenever you want to do the work. But no one but yourself can awaken it. The self can only act for unto itself. And also, ultimately, if you don't want to awaken it, that is perfectly fine too. The harmony of the universe still goes on. Life goes on regardless. And that is the certainty that a morally superior person also relies on. We've touched upon many things, certainties that a morally superior person knows, like evil having within it the seed of its own destruction and so on. But the morally superior person also knows if the rest of the world doesn't get it, and I don't necessarily want to run in their scaffolding when they're falling, because I might be preventing them from getting it by buffering them from falling. Maybe the fall is the thing that they need to have. We need to remember that for the times that are coming right now in our lives. But the man who's morally superior may also rely on that fact, that the false passes away, and it's okay to not have people awaken this, because that's where they are. That is their bliss at that moment in time, and it's all right. And he goes on the journey on his own path, because he's so involved in that and what it's doing to him. He's okay because he's touching that other noumena. He's aware that that is eternal. As we said, the eternal note, right? The eternal string, of which the other two are merely voices that can come and go. Schopenhauer talked about it. He understood this deeply. And he put it in a very, very succinct, simple language. He says, consciousness is certainly destroyed at death, as is the body. To be sure, but that which has been producing it is by no means destroyed. And the metaphor that I always use is about a match. He's saying that when you strike this match, which is the matter, think of the sulfur, the candle, the wax, or the match itself as the body, as this finite thing, right, being unto death. It can only burn a certain time. You strike it, and this amazing thing appears, this magical thing called light, the flame, this bioenergy appears. Where the hell did it come from? And then you say, well, the match is just burned down, but I can light another one. Then I can light another one, another one, and another one. I can fill the whole planet with matchsticks. I can fill the whole universe with matchsticks. And what has happened? The flame that came on the first match is not even one single iota reduced. So in your way of seeing, are you going to be identifying with the matchstick or the flame? He's saying that the consciousness can be destroyed, this blip, this ripple in the water, right? But that's an illusion, because that which has been doing the work to bring it into existence is absolutely eternal. There is no death, except in the way that we've described.